The Gospel according to Mark is counted one among the three synoptic Gospels. It is generally believed that the Gospel was in circulation in the early stages without the title, The Gospel according to Mark. In other words, it was in circulation anonymously. Most probably the title was later added to the book already in circulation because there arose a need to distinguish the Markan version of the Gospel from the other Gospel writings which have been now in circulation among the early Christian churches. As some have doubted, the title, The Gospel according to Mark, does not necessarily imply that Mark was the author. It could be simply meaning that this Gospel or this material is sourced from Mark. However, in the early Christianity, when this title was ascribed to a book, it actually meant the name of the person in the title was the author of the book. So in that sense, the Gospel according to Mark means Mark was considered to be the author of the book. It must be noted that the Markan authorship of the second Gospel was asserted or assumed by many early Christian writers. Christian writers too, like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, Origen, confirm that Mark was the author of the second Gospel and that he depended on Peter for his information. Perhaps the earliest reference to the Markan authorship comes from Papias, whom Eusebius quotes in his work. The claim that Mark was the author by Eusebius based on Papias implies that during the time of Eusebius, the second Gospel in the Bible was identified with Mark as the author. It also means that though Mark was not an eyewitness, he obtained his information about Jesus from Peter from his preachings, which has caused a lack of order in Mark's story. Some have doubted this statement of Papias as an effort to authenticate the Gospel when challenged by the dissidents, by associating it with Mark, who was with Peter in the last days. But this objection does not seem to be valid, since the effort of Papias was not seemingly to defend Markan authorship. Instead, he just mentions it. But then, who is this Mark to whom Papias and others are referring as the author of the second Gospel in the New Testament? For most scholars, it is almost certain that it is Mark who is mentioned in Acts chapter 12 verse 12, chapter 13 verse 5, etc. And in the fourth New Testament epistles, like in Colossians 4:10 or Philemon verse 24, or in 1 Peter 5 verse 13. He is the cousin of Barnabas, as we read in Colossians 4:10, who is also mentioned as John, also called Mark. He accompanied Paul and Barnabas to Pamphylia in their first missionary journey, according to Luke in Acts chapter 13 verse 5 and 13. Later he joined Paul towards the end of his life to serve him in the jail in Rome. Paul also mentions him in Philemon 24. It also seems that he was associating with Peter while Peter was imprisoned in Rome. Scholars argue that the unnamed young man in the Gospel who fled naked from Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, as mentioned in Mark chapter 14 verse 51 and 52, is an enigmatic reference to Mark himself. To such scholars, it is Mark's enigmatic self-reference. Some have found difficult to accept Mark as the author, for in the second Gospel we find a lot of errors in Jewish customs and Palestinian geography. Nevertheless, these errors do not specify anything about the identity of someone to disprove Markan authorship. Thus, for the identification, we need to depend upon the external evidences that comes from the early Christian tradition and history. While we conclude Markan authorship, those who are skeptical of Papias' information, for them the Gospel stands anonymous. So, when must have been the Gospel written? The two available traditions tell us that Mark either wrote it while Peter was still alive or after his martyrdom. There are several dates mentioned by the scholars. For example, C.C. Torrey, based on the expression abomination that causes desolation in chapter 13 verse 14, argues that this must be referring to the event of Emperor Gaius trying to install his statue in the Jerusalem temple. So it must be dated somewhere close to AD 40. However, Allen argues that the date before AD 50 should be more probable because Mark was first written in Aramaic. But then these arguments cannot be pursued further to argue without doubt. So it is doubtful. So these arguments are not much accepted. For some others like Harnack, the gospel came into existence only in the decade of 50s because Mark's gospel seems to have been the principal literary source to Luke. And if Luke's story in Acts chapter 28 finishes when Paul was in Rome, and then if Paul was in Roman house arrest around AD 61, then Mark must be written before that. So that's why Harnack and others would like to date the gospel somewhere close to AD 50s. Although these different dates are proposed, the majority of scholars today argue that Mark must have been written between AD 64 to 70. The reasons are like, number one, the earliest tradition favors Mark to have originated after the death of Peter. The internal evidences of Mark favors a date during or shortly after the Neronian persecution in Rome. All the conjunctures related to the date of Mark's gospel prefer the Neronian persecution context for the writing of the gospel. Similarly, Mark chapter 13 is said to reflect the situation in Palestine during the Jewish revolt and just before the Roman entrance into the city. It shows traces of the threatening nearness of the Jewish war that happened in AD 70 when the Jerusalem temple was finally destroyed. Thus, it must be dated between 67 to 69. Thus, it would be more reliable to think of Mark's gospel originating around AD 70 or just before that. From where did Mark write the gospel, or where were his readers? Though the earliest tradition is not unanimous about the place where Mark wrote the gospel, but it favors Rome. There are some who have suggested for places like Antioch, Alexandria, or even Galilee very specifically, or some other places. But these places have not found much acceptance among the scholars. For example, Bartlett argues for Antioch just because of its proximity to Palestine, and it was the larger Roman colony, and Peter was already in Antioch. But it is difficult for us to accept because other evidences conflict with this claim. Willie Marxian argued that it must be a place like Galilee from where the gospel was written and the readers were there, primarily because he called it as a Galilean gospel, and he finds a lot of emphasis on Galilee within the gospel. But the majority of the scholars today agree that it must have been written from Rome. Even from the ancient traditions, Anti-Marcian Prologue, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and others suggest Rome or a region of Italy to be the place from where it was written. Several reasons are taken into consideration to argue for Rome by majority of the scholars. For example, the large number of Latinism in the gospel. It proves that the audience were from the Latin context and somewhere close in the region of Italy or in Rome itself. Secondly, the apparently Gentile audience of the gospel, because in Mark's gospel, you will find a lot of emphasis upon Gentile mission. Thirdly, many allusions to suffering are meaningful in the light of the suffering of the church of Rome during the time of Nero's persecution. In 60s, Mark is located in Rome, and that we know from 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13. All these arguments brought together way more convincing than arguments laid in favor of other places for the writing of the gospel. So in that sense, Mark wrote it before AD 70, somewhere between 65 or 64 to AD 70. He wrote it for the believers in Rome. He wrote it from Rome. He acquired these stories and traditions about Jesus from Peter perhaps, and his gospel comes with an apostolic authority, although Mark himself was not an eyewitness to all these stories. What was the life setting of Mark and his readers when the gospel was written? If the gospel of Mark was written in the second half of the first century, especially around AD 60 to 70, then it was called forth by a crisis confronted by a Markan community. In appreciation to the life situation which indicate how Christians in Rome could be informed by the tract read in their meetings, that is, this gospel when it is read out to them in the churches. The emperor at this time was Nero. After 5 years of responsible rule between AD 54 to 59, he had shown himself as a reckless despot in relation to his autocracy in Rome. The situation radically altered after the disastrous fire that broke out and swept the entire Rome with fire in AD 64. The fire began among the cluttered shops near the Circus Maximus, but fanned by a strong wind, it quickly spread to the other parts of the city, burning down almost the whole city of Rome. The widespread disaster took turn to the Christians when suddenly the emperor tried to make Christians responsible for this fire, accusing them falsely. So Christians were made scapegoats, and this was the context in which they were persecuted, and perhaps Mark is now encouraging them by talking more about the suffering of Jesus and telling them that nothing unusual is happening with you. Every suffering that you undergo has been already undergone by Jesus himself. This changed the situation of the Christians. Thus, Mark's task was the projection of the Christian faith in a context of suffering and martyrdom. If Christians were to be strengthened and the gospel effectively proclaimed, it would be necessary to exhibit the similarity of situation faced by Jesus and the Christians of Rome. When Roman believers received the gospel according to Mark, they found that it spoke to the situation of the Christian community in Nero's Rome. In Mark's gospel, they found that nothing they could suffer from Nero was alien to the experience of Jesus. Jesus' experience of being misrepresented to the people and falsely labeled in chapter 3 verse 21 and 22, and to be betrayed by his disciple in chapter 3 verse 19, etc. were the experiences of Christians in Rome. This leads us to another important question to ask, that is, how does Mark speak about Jesus? Mark speaks about Jesus as fully human. He mentions Jesus as eating, drinking, hungry. He says that Jesus fell asleep out of fatigue in chapter 4 verse 38 and 39. Jesus touched people in chapter 1 verse 41. He is touched by people in chapter 5 verse 27. Jesus grieved like any other human being in chapter 3 verse 5, and he became indignant with the Jewish leaders in chapter 10 verse 14. Although all these evidences show that Jesus was very human and like anybody else, the gospel begins with the claim that it is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in chapter 1 verse 1, and that the Jesus as the Son of God is the main feature of the revelatory scene of the baptism too. When Jesus was baptized, the heavenly declaration is about the Jesus, the human Jesus about whom Mark is narrating the story. He is declared to be the Son of God. Mark balances the humanity and divinity of Jesus by juxtaposing the Christological titles in his gospel story. While in the first section, chapter 2, he mentions Jesus as the Son of Man. Little later, in chapter 3 and 5, he mentions twice Jesus as the Son of God and tries to balance between Jesus as Son of Man, his humanity more, and Jesus as Son of God, his divine title. Similarly, Son of God and Son of Man are placed together in the gospel, just trying to make a balance between two. Mark did not want to give an impression that he is simply human or he is simply divine, but he is human in every sense. He was like one among us, but at the same time, he is different. He is Son of God. In the second half of the gospel, very obviously the question of the nature of Jesus is directly posed and answered. And at the same time, the salvific necessity of his death and resurrection is referred. For example, in all the three occasions when Jesus predicts his own death, Jesus always says that it is necessary for the Son of Man to suffer these things. And he also says that it is necessary for him to lay down his life as a ransom for many. So there is a necessity which is associated with this man Jesus to suffer at the end. But at this point, Mark is trying to say that this one person who is very much human like us is the Son of God, destined to suffer and die. So in that sense, Jesus is the suffering Son of God. Further, Mark also presents a balanced Christology in which Jesus' miracle working power is set beside his suffering and death. The one who is identified as the Son of God in the opening verse of the Gospel is confessed to be the Son of God by the Roman centurion as Jesus died, humiliated and in agony on the cross, chapter 15, verse 39. What does he speak about the return of the Son of Man? His apocalyptic thinking. Mark holds strongly the early Christian apocalyptic hope for the imminent coming of Jesus as the Son of Man. He thinks of himself and his church as caught up in the events that mark the end of history. So, living in this situation of an eschatological period, Mark believes that the church and he have got a special responsibility to fulfill. And what is that responsibility that they need to fulfill in this intermediate period is that they have to involve in mission to the Gentiles, because in Mark's gospel there's a strong emphasis on Gentiles and there's a clear-cut mandate for the church to go out and to preach to all the people. Mark has a strong concern for Gentiles and the Hellenistic Jewish Christian mission to them. This is evident in his explicit reference to the conversion of Gentiles. The Jews reject Jesus, the Son of Man, and the gospel goes to others in chapter 12 verses 9 to 11. The gospel must be preached first to all the nations. That's what Mark says in chapter 13 verse 10. He also mentions that the elect are from the ends of the earth who will share in the table of the Messiah in chapter 13 verse 27. There is also remarkable reference to the Gentiles in the miracle story. All these things put together tells us that Mark's gospel was the first gospel to be written based on the Markan hypothesis and the synoptic studies. It tells us that before AD 70, this gospel was written by Mark, who drew information about Jesus from Peter, the apostle. He was writing to a particular group of people who were living in Rome and were suffering under the Neronian persecution. So for Mark, it is much more important to speak about the suffering aspect of Jesus' life and mission in order that he may encourage his readers by that. He wants to just tell them that you suffer nothing new. Rather, everything that you suffer now has been experienced by Jesus, who brought salvation for you. He was simply human like us, who suffered for us, but then he was the Son of God, who is capable to bring the good news to us In fact, Jesus is the good news, the gospel that Mark wants to introduce to his readers. And rightly so, the Gentile centurion in the end of the gospel recognizes the true identity of this man named Jesus as the Son of God. Interestingly, an important claim and the right understanding of Jesus in Mark's gospel is put in the lips of a Gentile centurion. So also today, for Mark, his readers need to understand that as they suffer and undergo persecution, they are to recognize Jesus in the right way as others, like centurion, has recognized him. He is the Son of God, the suffering one, who is suffering for the salvation of the Gentiles. The gospel must be preached further to them. Every effort must be done during this intermediate time when where the church is caught up, and the time must be redeemed by preaching the gospel of Christ Jesus to them. And that's why Mark undertakes this huge responsibility of narrating the story of Jesus to his readers. Thank you.